Welcome, gentle reader. Today we have an episode of Everything is Everything, which is on a different line of attack compared to many of the other things we've done. This is on the subject of podcasting. Okay, so before Amit Varma became a world famous inventor and producer of a YouTube show, he, in his previous incarnation, uh, pioneered the format of the podcast in India. He was one of the first people in with a good, well done podcast, and he just rode that through the years to build an amazing product. It has a culture and an ethos of its own, and it has a loyal readership all over the world. Uh, in addition to building this and figuring it out and making mistakes and iterating his way to the strategy on how to do a podcast, Amit was also scrupulously generous in giving away all his knowledge. I have seen on numerous occasions how others have asked him, how do you do X? And he has always been fully open in terms of sharing all the knowledge and just being a good person, a good member of the community, passing on knowledge to all the others. Today, he's going to take us through his full thought process on what it means to create and build and run a podcast. Okay, in terms of terminology, by podcast we mean audio podcast. Many times people are using the word podcast for everything is everything, which I think is confusing. It's better to call it a YouTube show as opposed to what the seen and the unseen is an audio podcast. So Amit is a master of the craft, and he's going to tell us how it's done. So Amit, uh, do you want to start with some high level reflections on all the amazing things that happened to you in this journey?
So I have no high level reflections, but just to set the context straight, in YouTube we are beginners. You are right that I think of this as a YouTube show, not a podcast. I hate it when video shows are given the term podcast, and we are kind of beginners. We are learning the ropes, and these are early days, and that's great. Audio podcasting is completely separate with a completely separate audience. So when the Seen and the Unseen started 7 years ago, it was like just an experiment. And I thought I'll do 15, 20-minute episodes. And my sense was, and I was wrong about everything I thought I knew about podcasting. I thought people have a short attention span. You got to get them early. You can't go on for too long, etc., etc. Now today, for reasons I will elaborate, I know that all of that is rubbish. What sort of happened during that journey is that the Seen and the Unseen went from a show that had shortish episodes like that, which then became deep dives into subjects, which could last 3 hours, 4 hours, which then became deep dives into people, almost like oral histories, which could last 7 hours, 8 hours and more. And as it got longer and longer, I got more and more love from people. Like I recently tried to calculate back of the envelope calculation, how much have people listened to the show. And it's at least the conservative estimate about 20 million hours heard, right? So, which is mind-boggling to me, but I do get a sense of this when I go out on the road, and I think 13 out of the last 17 times I've been at an airport, someone stopped me and said, are you Amit Varma? Thank you for what you do for an audio podcast, right? So it is, in many ways really different from what we are trying to do on YouTube, and there is a YouTube version of the channel as well over here that gets less than 1% of my, total views or downloads, as it were. All the listening is on audio. It is a unique medium, and it's a medium that demands and enables a particular kind of content, and I want to talk about that today. Now, a lot of people know me for the writing course that I teach, the art of clear writing, which I've been fortunate enough to have taught more than 2,600 people at the time of recording, and that's done very well. I also had a podcasting course, which was a 3-week course, and that would kind of get a nicher audience, as it were, and I would do it twice a year. And I have now decided I will never do it again. Instead, I want to give away all of that knowledge, everything that I have learned over here. So what you see on the screen right now, dear reader, is a table of contents of all the things I'm going to talk about for however long it takes, as long as the light lasts and my energy kind of goes on. But it's just my effort to share whatever I've learned about this beautiful form which has changed me as a person. And I mean that most sincerely, and I'll elaborate on why that is the case. So let's get started.
As long as you can see the light.
There's no Creedence Clearwater Revival, it seems. It's a great song, and I'll send you a great cover of the song as well. So chapter one, I want to talk about why is audio special. I just said that, hey, that's a whole different ball game. It is not like YouTube without the video, right? Audio is a whole different ball game. Why is it special? And I want to start with my early lessons. When I began, my impression was that you got to grab them in the first 15 seconds. Attention spans are short. Don't do more than 15 minutes, 20 minutes. I found out I was completely wrong. And I found out I was completely wrong because of three reasons. Reason number one, consider when people listen to podcasts, right? People listen to podcasts. The typical use case enabled by the smartphone is, there are three use cases. Number one, when people are commuting, so you're in the local train or you're driving, you've got the podcast on. Number two, when you're working out, so you've gone for a run or a walk and you've got the podcast on. Number three, you're doing errands, like you're doing the dishes or whatever. And during COVID, many of us did more errands, and indeed we should do more errands even now, right? And what is common to all of them is that you are a captive audience. So when anybody who is watching Everything is Everything right now, you can just go to another tab. You can turn your head and you can talk to someone who's standing there. You can pick up a book on the table. With your right hand, you can pick up your phone and look at it even as this video is playing. But when you are out running, you are not going to get distracted. You have chosen to listen to something, and you are going to continue listening to it. I don't know why I did this. You're going to continue listening to this. So you're a captive audience. So that is reason number one. Consider when you listen. After that, consider how you listen. Most regular audio podcast listeners will listen at higher speeds. And there is a simple reason for this. Our brain can comprehend up to 500 words a minute. We speak at about 160 to 200 words a minute. I'm at about 160. And therefore, there is a spare attentional capacity, as it were. There is a spare capacity, which might also, account for us getting bored sometimes where we are listening to someone, because they're literally talking slower than our brain can process. So what happens when you're listening to a podcast is it is very easy to dial the speed up and get used to a higher speed. And instinctively you might recoil at this, and you might say that no, it'll be squeaky and all of that. Actually, it won't. I would urge every listener to actually try it. Take it to 1.2x, it will normalize. Take it to 1.5x, it will normalize. And at some point, it will normalize and go no further, and that is your natural level. And one should not be judgmental about what you listen at. What you listen at is what you listen at. Some people listen at 1x, that's perfect. I listen to most things at 2x or more than that. I can go up to 3 for research for an episode. I had to hear many episodes of a podcast my friend had done. So I heard a 3.5x, and I could manage because I normalized each step. And, Krish Ashok once did an episode with me where he gave me this great anecdote that there was a visually impaired friend of his, basically a blind colleague of his, who could listen at 6x. Now you see the plasticity of the brain. If I take anything to 6x, beyond a point it's mush, I can't make it out. But the brain adjusts. You can listen at higher speeds. And it is not the case that you miss any nuance. People will say, oh, I like the silences and this and that. But the point is the silences, the pauses, you are getting them anyway. The brain normalizes. So you're getting all the nuance, you're getting everything. So trust me on that, try that.
Yeah. And so I just want to say to everyone precisely what you said, that I feel we should say to people, consider exploring higher speeds. And then each person will land in a natural and correct locale, and there is no one answer. But it is a very new discovery. It was a very new discovery for me when I even heard about this possibility that, oh wow, this could be done. So like that, let's just encourage people, try it, because maybe it'll work for you.
And there is a third reason. I've spoken about the when you listen, I've spoken about the how you listen. There is a why you listen. And the why is really simple. It is a lie that we live in a shallow world and we want shallow things. Everybody wants to go deep. And the rest of the media gives you content that is a mile wide and an inch deep. And everybody craves depth. And the thing is, we contain multitudes. There are times I'm also just scrolling through Instagram and you don't really have time to do a deep dive. But there are times you really want to know something. You really want to go deep. An example of this, of attention spans, for example, is the binge watching that we do. Right? We used to watch 2-hour movies, 3-hour movies. Now we watch 7 hours at a go because we are binging something. Attention spans are not the problem. When you want to go deep, you can go deep. And the most efficient way of going deep is audio. People don't realize this. I actually first realized this when I did the first of my 4 episodes with Karthik Muralidharan, and he speaks at 1.5x, as you know. And it was a 3-hour, 15-minute episode. He got it transcribed. It came to 45,000 words. 45,000 words is a short book. It's half a regular size book. If you're listening at double speed, in 90 minutes, which is some people's commute, you are getting directed content with an expert, and the amount of insight and wisdom there is incredible. So it is all three of these come together. Consider when you listen in situations when you're a captive audience, how do you listen? You're listening at double speeds and losing none of the nuance or, the finer details. And number three, you want depth. Nobody gives you depth. Audio is the most efficient way to get that depth. Many of us in our busy lives, we may not have time to sit down and read a book and take notes and all of that. But we are commuting, we are hopefully working out, we are washing dishes. And those are times where we can use that time and use our brain and consume great content.
I disagree with you slightly. I think that there is a tiny fraction of the world that craves depth and has the appetite for depth. And that's great, meaning, seen and the unseen, and to a lesser extent, everything is everything caters to that audience. Most humans want diversion. Okay? So most humans are fine with being fed entertainment industry slosh, and that's okay, no harm. And then there are people who have an appetite for depth. So it doesn't have to be the case to explain your observed phenomena. It doesn't have to be the case that everybody craves depth. Some crave depth, and that's enough. Like, then there is a great audience out there, and we make progress.
I agree and disagree in the sense that, yeah, actually you're right. Most people don't seem to really want to, read books, listen to music, explore, what they don't already know, what is not in their comfort zone. But I think everybody has a capacity to appreciate depth. And, anything can be a trigger that drives them into depth. But yeah, I mean, I'll touch upon this subject a little later as well.
Amit, when I first heard about podcasting, I immediately thought this is time-shifted radio. That in a world of broadcast radio, there would be a particular show at 9 p.m. and my father would be there to listen to the news at 9 p.m. But now it's time-shifted. You can go get NPR, all things considered, at any time of the day. So I thought that there was a natural segue from old-style broadcast radio to radio on demand, and then the democratization of modern technology, that anybody can make their show. Is this a correct intuition on how to think of this, or is this different in interesting ways?
Podcasting is fundamentally different from radio. My first intuition before I became a podcaster was it is like Netflix for audio. It's the same as radio, except now I can choose the time to listen to it. And that's what I thought, and I thought that's the only difference. And that is not true for a number of reasons, including structural reasons you will appreciate. So I want to say three things here. Point number one is that radio, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, is forced to be broad and shallow. For example, if you just look at the Indian environment, the license fees to get an FM channel are incredibly high. And because they are incredibly high, you are forced to cater to the lowest common denominator and recoup the money, which is basically talk Bollywood and etc. etc. FM isn't even allowed to do news and talk politics and all of that. So it's always the lowest common denominator. You cannot sort of explore a niche in any way. These are just the incentives. Now, there are very few places that have a vibrant FM culture where New York might have 80 FM stations or whatever, and they can explore some niches, but even there, they can't go particularly deep. And that is sort of the nature of the beast. Now, the second point I want to make is that podcasting allows you to go deep and it allows you to get intimate. And that intimacy factor I want to talk about a little bit. It allows you to go deep because the means of production, which is my next point, are basically free. Anybody can start a podcast without spending anything except their time. And therefore, they can do things that otherwise may not be possible in a place with commercial imperatives. That, oh, we have paid so much license fee, we have 24 hours in a day, we cannot afford to give you an 8-hour talk show, for example. So you can get into, you can explore niches that might be there. And niches actually are huge. Like in a country like India, even a small niche in absolute terms is huge. And if you look at the globe as your market, the weirdest of niches actually can get you large numbers.
So this is the same long tail phenomenon
it's a long tail
of eBay or Amazon applied to this field.
But with a difference. what has happened in recent years is long form podcasting. I won't claim I'm a pioneer of it, though, what I do in many ways is with the 8-hour shows and all that is taking it a step ahead. But there are people who've done 5-hour, 6-hour, 7-hour episode. Rogan has had 5-hour episodes. Lex Fridman has, at least one 7-hour episode, I think. And they are great and they're amazing. And the point is that no one would have ever figured out that there is even that niche that exists. Like, I love listening to long form, but I would never have known. I would have thought, no, who's going to listen to 8 hours? I would never have simply known. But all of the confluence of the above factors I mentioned in the last chapter came together. And now you have a niche that nobody knew existed, and the niche itself did not know it existed. And I'm just giving you one example when it comes to length and long form. But there are all kinds of weird specialist niches that, people wouldn't even have known that this is a niche. Even that act of discovering a niche only happens where anybody can go out and make whatever they want, and then magic happens in the margins. Now I want to double click on the point of intimacy. Now, one great metaphorical way of looking at the experience of both audio visual and audio that I learned connects with me deeply. And here's a metaphor. Let's say you go to a movie theater to watch a movie, right? There is a big screen which is a certain distance away from you, and often on the other side of the screen, the camera will be a certain distance away from the actors. So you'll have your grand westerns and your car chases, and you have that kind of scale. You're watching it on the big screen. You immediately cut back and you're watching something on television. There are 2-3 meters between you and the television, and there's a similar distance between the camera and the actors. So you have Seinfeld and Friends and all of that. Your indoor sitcoms and all do the best there. Then let's say you come to YouTube. And YouTube is, your laptop is half a meter away, or you're holding your phone like this. And a lot of made for YouTube content is exactly that. The frame is now much closer, the camera and the person are much closer. When I take it to audio, I think of radio as 4 people in a car. There are 4 people in a car, or people in a bus even, and the radio is speaking to all of them, and it is kind of broadcasty and is speaking to everyone. Podcasting is a voice in your head. It is a most intimate medium in the world. And I cannot tell you what kind of magic this brings about. People will often say, do I need to learn voice modulation to be a podcaster? And I'm like, no. Maybe on radio you want to be, throwing your voice, talking in a particular announcery way. Namaskar, aaj hum aapko batane wale hain. But you don't. It would actually be a bug and not a feature in podcasting. People expect intimacy. One compliment I got, which I take to heart, and many people have told me similar things over time, is some listener heard my Scene Unseen episode with Abhinandan Sekri, and he said that I felt so much that I'm sitting in a living room talking to 2 of my friends that at one point I interrupted you.
Wow.
Right? And there is nothing, and that tells you what that intimacy is, that people can come up to me in public places and feel like they know me, and I'm happy they do. Feel free to kind of you're not intruding if you ever do that. Feel free to do that, because that validation is my greatest reward, that people are listening and the show means something to them. And that's beautiful. And it is the most intimate medium. There is nothing like that. So, the first 2 reasons, radio is broad but shallow and podcasting is deep and intimate, that kind of tells you what. And the third difference is a difference that you alluded to, that anybody can start a podcast, boss. I don't need a license from the government, that podcasting license. I don't need to pay money to anyone. And the technology is so advanced and so affordable that anyone can literally start a podcast for free, right? And you can kind of go up the ladder and so on. But at the start, it is free. It is your time. You are limited only by your imagination. And like, we don't appreciate how freaking magical this is. 30 years ago, I could not have imagined any of this. This is magic. Sufficiently advanced times. That's where we are. So yeah.
So let me give you an example of what you were just saying. We have a good friend, Josh Feldman, who has appeared on your show, and our good friend Anjali Sharma was saying to me that we have known Josh for 15 years, and yet there were things that happened in the podcast that were completely new to me. And Josh replied saying, you never asked me, otherwise I would have always told you. But there is something about that moment of that conversation that produces something unique from the guest.
I wanted to hold that thought, and I want to come back to it later when I'm talking about the art of the interview and I finish that section, because to me that is kind of the greatest magic. Like, I have recorded episodes with friends I have known for 15 or 20 years. And in the course of the episode, I realized I didn't know them at all. And you just find out so much about a person. Like, listen, you'll hang out with a friend, 100 times for half an hour each, 1 hour each. You'll have a beer, you'll talk shop, you'll do this, you'll do that, but you'll be skimming on the surface. How many times have you asked your friends about, tell me about your parents, tell me about home, tell me about your mom, what makes you cry at night, you know, and so on and so forth, and that's kind of magical. Like, one of the, and I'm probably sort of cannibalizing on what I'm going to talk about later, but I'm going to say it anyway because you've hit this nerve. That one of the most beautiful things about that I have discovered while doing this show, and the reason I do long form, is that you can go to those places where nobody else can. If I want to listen to person expert X on subject Y, I can go on YouTube, I'll do a search, there'll be like 40 talks, 10 panel discussions, all of that will be there. But I don't know their soul. And that this gives me a chance to do that. So I remember, like everybody knows Ram Guha, he's been caricatured by both the left and the right in terrible ways. How many people really get a sense of him as a person? But he's come on my show 6 times, and he's spoken about how sometimes he will just go into his bedroom and he will lie down on the bed and he'll listen to Hindustani classical music and he'll lose all track of time, and his wife will come home in the evening and she'll open the door and in that dark room she'll find that Ram is lying there listening to music. And when he says this, and when you look at the show notes and the particular songs or the ragas that he listens to, the particular performances are linked there. And when you listen to them and you feel that thing and you know how he felt in that moment, that is a remarkable human connection. Podcasting gets you that. That is the intimacy. You are not going to get that anywhere else. It is a voice in your head, it is your eyes closed, you're all alone, you're in that space. So, the next part of the slideshow, when I have spoken about these things, is what I call the two imperatives, right? And these are early lessons that I learned. And I think these are lessons that are true for all creators, but particularly for audio podcasters, given the nature of the medium. And I'll just stop saying audio podcasters and say podcasters now that we've established what we mean. And one of them is respect the listener. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that earlier, all entertainment, whether it's TV or audio or whatever, were the few talking to the many, right? They could be condescending, they could be patronizing. It is like, you are the masses and we will tell you things and we will broadcast to you what we feel and we will lecture to you and blah, blah, blah. And what the intimacy of broadcasting also brings with it is that you can't do that shit, you know. Uh, you are interesting in certain ways to the listener, that's why they're listening to you. But in many ways, they know more than you do. They are accomplished people. In most different contexts, you are a listener. When I listen to Lex Fridman or Sam Harris, I am the listener. I'm in that space. I feel that familiarity, but I also want to be respected and they respect me, right? And that is the whole thing, that don't talk down to them, respect their time and speak to them as if they're human beings on the other side. No artifice is required. And that brings me to the second point, that you have to be authentic to yourself. I remember the first time I taught my podcasting course, one of the participants asked me that, is there a niche I can take up? Is there a gap in the market? And I said, no, don't think like that. That's a terrible way to think. There is only one gap in the market. You aren't there, right? There are more than 7 billion people on this planet. Only one thing sets you apart, and that thing is that you are you, right? So you have to be authentic to yourself. That is the only thing you have which sets you apart. And people will often suffer from the imposter syndrome and say, what have I achieved? Why will anybody listen to me? There might be 7 billion people, but there are also 1 million podcasts. Why me? And I would just say that, in a sense, you are on a journey. Right? For me, what was the seen and the unseen? It's my intellectual journey. It's stuff I'm curious about. I don't just call people who are in the news. I call people I want to know more about. I talk about subjects I want to know more about. It's my journey. I take the listener on a journey with me, and once they vibe and they say ki haan, I'm finding things of value here, or I'm on a similar journey, then they will come along. So no matter who you are on a journey at some point in the journey, and anyone else who is at any other point in that journey, whether through life or could be an intellectual journey, they will connect with you, they will vibe with you, right? They will feel that intimacy and that one-on-one connection, and that will be enough, and that's all you need, that you have to be authentic to yourself.
Is there a useful distinction between the true fan that will generally listen to every episode versus the people that think well about the show and will occasionally come in when a person or a subject is of interest.
So I'm going to touch on it later when I talk about the 1,000 True Fans and what that concept is. But my sense is that with something like podcasting, especially, once people connect with you, it's a personal connection, they'll kind of follow you. Now, if you're talking to someone they're really not interested in, or on a subject they're really not interested in, then you might lose them momentarily. They may not listen to every episode, which is fine. And it is not that, we release our stuff weekly, but people don't have to watch weekly. Some people will turn up every Friday because now, as we get in the comments, it's a fix, right? Even though everything is relatively like tiny compared to the seen and the unseen, but already that loyal audience is building, which will land up every Friday. But even if they don't, it's okay. Maybe somebody binges 3-4 episodes at a time.
I meant from the viewpoint of imagining a guest and in the thread of conversation. You're not thinking there are two audiences.
Yeah,
Are you thinking there are two audiences? Like one is my every Monday regular, and the other is the people who will drop by occasionally and go into the archive.
I don't think of the audience at all.
Okay.
So even when you and I started the show, dear listener, we, my plea to Ajay, and I'll talk later in this very sort of episode about why that is. But my plea to Ajay was, let's not look at the numbers for 2 years. Let's just do what we are doing and not consider the numbers at all. And after 104 episodes, we'll see where we are. And I'll give my reasoning for this later. So my sense is, I don't want to think about an audience. मैं, akla chalo re, and then whoever comes along. That's sort of my philosophy.
Amit, most of us know the seen and the unseen. Is there a simple classification scheme or a way to imagine the space of podcasts where this is one kind of podcast, but there could be many others?
So there are broadly two kinds of podcasts, but both these kinds contain multitudes. So you can think of podcasts that are doing storytelling, and you can think of podcasts that are interview podcasts, conversation podcasts. And I have a bunch of tips on both, and I want to start with storytelling, right? And before I kind of launch into the many tips that I have about audio storytelling, I just want us to appreciate again how audio is unique here. So Robert McKee, who's written many great books on storytelling, often says that story is a natural form of thought. Right? We think about the complex world and figure it out by telling stories to each other. And before all technology is, how do we tell stories? We tell their audio. You tell me something, I use my imagination from the way that you told me the story, and I interpret it that way. And that's the beauty of audio storytelling, that it is the oldest form of storytelling. And even within the universe of storytelling that we have today, where you can write, you can make movies, you can make YouTube videos. There's a universe of ways of telling stories. There are still some fundamental things. Audio remains, I think, incredibly powerful, and there are still some fundamental things that we should remember about it.
Tell us.
So tip number one is keep it simple. Right? One piece of information at a time. And the reason for this is logistical. When I am reading something, I can take in a complex sentence. If required, I can go back in the sentence. If required, I can go to the previous sentence. But when we are listening, typically if I'm jogging and I'm listening to something at double speed, why did you smile when I did this? This is, I'm extremely offended. So anyway, so typically...
This should be the YouTube short advertising everything is everything.
No, so I'll change. Forget commuting, washing dishes. So if I'm washing dishes and I'm listening, I can't rewind to figure out last sentence mein kya bola. My attention can slip. And if there's a complicated sentence, it is hard for me to keep track of it. So one standard rule is that construct your sentences in a way which doesn't make it difficult for the reader to process what they are. Now, I want to give you an example of this. I'm going to give you a print example of how you would write a particular sentence, and then talk about why that doesn't work for audio, and then I'm going to rewrite it for you for audio. So here on the screen, as you see, here is a print sentence. The famous podcaster Amit Varma, while conducting a webinar on writing from his home office in Andheri, Mumbai, was arrested by the Delhi police for the crime of making Delhi more polluted by broadcasting his convoluted classes there. Right? Now what happened is, note the clauses over here. the famous podcaster Amit Varma, while blah 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 blah, in blah blah blah, was arrested by blah 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 for the crime of blah blah blah, etc. etc. Right? It is a lot for the reader to keep in their head, because you are asking them to hold one thing in their head, and then you add another thing, and then you add another thing, and it can work in print. Though ideally you shouldn't make it too hard for the reader there as well, but it can work in print. Now, how I would rewrite it for audio is this: I would just say, the famous podcaster Amit Varma is behind bars. The Delhi police came to Mumbai to pick him up. He was charged with etc. etc. Right? So, one thing at a time, and you kind of keep it simple. Don't overload the listener, because appreciate where the listener is. The listener is, no, I will not do that action. The listener is washing dishes. Now I'll do this. The listener, and is this okay?
You've got
Whatever.
an elevated platform.
Yes, the listener is washing dishes on an elevated platform, and so you have to be mindful of this. And you're not dumbing it down like this. You're giving her all the information she wants, but you are doing it with the recognition of the circumstance that doesn't allow her, for example, to go back, and that doesn't allow her to process convoluted sentences easily. So you also, for example, avoid dependent clauses. Like, here's another example on the screen where you could say, Amit Varma, while continuing to conduct a webinar from his mobile phone while in the police van, protested his innocence before the officers in khaki, one of whom he berated for using an adverb. Right? So you have that dependent clause, Amit Varma, while blah, 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 and then you get to the verb. And this is, by the way, I will never do my writing masterclass like this, because my writing course is my bread and butter. But one tip there which I can share is that while you should always begin with subject and verb, don't put something between the subject and the verb, because it then gets complicated. Like the moment I say something like Ajay Shah, the audience wants to know, what has Ajay Shah done? What about him? But then if you put a dependent clause like this, Ajay Shah, while sipping from his herbal tea that he made with the 74 herbs he had gathered in his garden, and then the verb comes, you've spent too much time. So you'd rather say that Ajay Shah stabbed his co-host Amit with a knife, and that is a much more dramatic sort of way to put it.
On a related note, I read an interview with Paul Simon, and he was asked, what's the difference between writing poetry and writing songs? And Paul Simon said that the human mind will inevitably go up and down a poem 50 times. And that's a poem. It is a piece of art. It is like physical painting. And the mind is going to look at it 20 times and examine it in many ways. Songs are linear. So you don't get a second take. I mean, until the first few times, a person is not going to deep dive in a song. So a good song has to work in a linear way and not assume too much about what came before. And he also said that the attention of the human mind is completely uncontrolled. So the song will be playing on the radio and the person will be ignoring it, they'll be driving, and suddenly there'll be something in the music or the words that catches a person. And then you've got the person on the journey only from the middle till the end. Then don't put up prerequisites that you had to be with me from the beginning.
Beautiful. And, in the clearing stands a songwriter, a poet by his side. And Paul Simon, of course, just a remarkable songwriter and a great poet also in his own way. So my next point is that structure is important. Right? It is good to play around. It is good to experiment. A lot of experiments succeed. But there is a reason that there is a structure to our thinking. There is a reason that, there'll be a common kind of 3-act structure that people will keep recommending for, movies and so on and so forth. That, you have a setup, you have a conflict, you have a resolution, etc., etc. And the thing is, you should not be dogmatic about this. You should not be dogmatic about structure, but you should understand that you have a listener. Why is a listener going to continue to listen? Right? And typically, when you're telling a story, a listener will continue to listen because they feel empathetic towards a character, they start caring about a character, and they feel curious about some conflict the character is going through, and they want to know how it sort of works out. Now, of course, you can do, in novels, there have been great experimental novels written where this structure doesn't really matter, and I'm completely okay with that. I sort of love those. But I just want audio storytellers to think about what is a structure. At every moment, why will the listener stay with you? Margaret Atwood once said, a word after a word after a word is power. This indicates you cannot take the reader for granted. And she was talking in the context of writing, but obviously even more true of audio storytelling, that you cannot take the listener for granted. You have to hold their attention. And structurally, you have to understand why. Like, there is this beautiful advice given by Kurt Vonnegut where he says every character must want something, even if it is only a glass of water. Because what draws us into the story, it is that wanting, it is that desire. Will that character get a glass of water? What will that character do to get that glass of water? You have a glass of water right there, but there is no water in it, or there's a little bit. So, so think about structure as well. Perhaps not when you're writing your first draft or you're writing a script or whatever, doesn't matter. That can be a dump of the brain. But then think about how the listener will respond to what you have written and structure it accordingly so that the listener is with you throughout. So my third tip is a standard writing tip. It's an incredible tip. It is show, don't tell. What does show don't tell mean fundamentally? It does not mean that you describe a particular scene and that's what you mean by show, not at all. What it means is that instead of using abstract terms and telling a reader something, you show it to them through an action. So typically, if you're doing a good job, you will use less adjectives and you will use more verbs. There is a saying of how nouns name the world, verbs activate them. All of the action of the world, all of the interest in the world is in verbs, and verbs show you so much. Like there is a classic cliche in filmmaking that where is a scene, where is a pet the dog scene, right? And what is pet a dog a cliche for? You want to show something about a particular character. Maybe you want to show that he's a good person, he's an empathetic, warm person. So you show him petting a dog, right? So through that action, through that verb, he pets a dog, you realize this is a guy who likes dogs, and therefore you are shown something about him instead of being told that this is a nice guy or a wonderful guy. And adjectives like nice and wonderful don't even mean that much anyway, right? And this can also happen in audio, where you can show by describing the actions of people what they have done rather than tell them that so and so was a loving boyfriend or a loving husband or whatever. Now, there are two iconic sort of landmarks in radio history which paved the way. One was in 1957. I don't know whether to call it a play or an album, called The Ballad of John Axon. Now, this is a real life story. John Axon was a railway driver, and at one point he was driving a train where he knew that at some point the train he can't control it, is going to careen out and is going to go wherever. And he had two choices, and one choice is that I jump out and save myself, and the other choice is that I stay on the train and do whatever I can do to save lives up ahead. And he stayed on the train and he died. And so this bunch of people wrote a bunch of songs about him. But what they also did was they went to his village and they took interviews of all the people who knew him. And they did not mean for any of these interviews to be part of the final product. They just took the interviews. They took, the sound of the train wherever they are, the background noise, the family, somebody's crying in the background. They took all of this. And then they had the master stroke that why don't we use all of this? And they used it. And it tells you so much, right? It tells you so much when you hear somebody who knew him talk about him, rather than say, oh, his villagers considered him to be a good guy, or even sing about that. Another classic landmark of audio, and I don't know whether it will be available online, put it in the comments, somebody, if it is something called Son of the Family, SUN. This was a Danish radio show made circa 1997 about this young musician who killed himself. And what these people did, these producers did, was while making this show, they went and they spoke to his parents, they spoke to his brother, they spoke to his girlfriend. It is heartbreaking when you listen to it. And it is show don't tell. In the inflection of their voices, in the particular memories that they have, you get a full picture of a person just coming to life, right? Which otherwise, if you were merely told about him in abstract sentences, you would never have known. So audio can be incredibly powerful that way if you use your imagination and you think about it. My next tip for storytelling is beware the curse of knowledge. Right now, 2-3 episodes back, we were chatting about some technical subject I've forgotten, and Vaishnav, our crew member, came to me and said that you spoke about those things that because you know them so well that you didn't spend long enough, but I wish you had explained it a bit more because I wanted to dive deeper. And he was right. I had committed the curse of knowledge. Now, what is the curse of knowledge? The curse of knowledge is that when you know a subject so well, you imagine that the readers or the listeners will share a similar baseline of knowledge with it, right? So you, for example, when you start talking about monetary policy, I suspect you commit the curse of knowledge. We don't know all the terms, and sometimes I'm like, kya bol raha hai, soda lao. So, that is something that we should be aware of, especially in audio, because in audio, the listener can't reverse. So, when you're setting up a scene, you have to set it up in such a way that it is clear. In their imagination, you want the listener to be able to visualize what is happening, where is it happening. If one character is doing something, what are they doing? If an unfamiliar voice starts speaking, you can't wait too long to introduce them. You want to say who it is. Ideally, you want to say who it is before. In many podcasts, there is this fashion that they'll bring on a soundbite and then they'll say, "This is Professor Ajay Shah talking about whatever." And I'm kind of okay with that. It's become a cliche and a trope. But in general, you want to realize that you don't want to leave the listener in ignorance for too long about what the fuck is going on. You want to clear that up as much as possible so they can get engrossed in your story itself, which is what you want them to do. So understand that follow a narrative and figure out that don't take it for granted that the listener knows everything that you know. That's a great danger storytellers can sometimes commit. You don't have to spell everything out, but at the same time, you don't want to, like that phrase goes, "Bokla gaya." You don't want them to think, "Bokla gaya, I don't know what's going on." So you want to take care of that.
Gentle reader, we had an Everything is Everything episode on 4 papers, and the video as released is a cleaned up masterpiece where again and again Amit would just stop me and say, "You've gone all gobbledygook." And I was talking about monetary policy and fiscal policy, and for me these are just like breathing, and he was the one saying, "No, this does not work."
Though, to be fair, I must tell you, that's the only time we've done that shit. We never, what you actually see on Everything is the organic conversation, more or less as it happens. We don't edit much. We don't, we just keep the flow going, clean it up a bit. That was a one time that, I did that because I couldn't understand what you were saying, Ajay Shah. That's not fair. I need to understand. Tip number 5, and it might seem obvious, but define the story in the sense that from whose point of view are you telling it and who's the hero. Sometimes, if you are telling a story, you could be the protagonist and your journey of discovery could be the story. Sometimes you are a facilitator for what the other characters are doing. Sometimes you are not there at all and the story is, in a sense, telling itself. So, you don't want to get confused about this. You want a clear track, you want to be able to define the story for
You have
yourself.
to choose the voice and then be entirely consistent. That if I'm going to tell a story in omniscient voice, it will be entirely in omniscient voice.
Exactly, and even if you shift, you have to be clear. Why are you shifting? Will that have a disorienting effect for the listener? You need to think it all out. But I would again tell budding storytellers out there, and this is something I talk about at length in my writing course, that don't be intimidated by this stuff. Your first draft should just be a dump of your brain. None of these apply to that. But once you have that dump, then you can begin to work with it. So my next tip is that remember that the reader can't reverse. Right, this is important to note, and this is a tip I give even in my writing course. Like, I don't like a word like the latter. Every time you see the latter, what happens? You have to go to the previous sentence to see what are the two things a person mentioned, and then you reconstruct this sentence with, the second thing mentally. Might take microseconds, but it takes an effort, as previously mentioned. Or passive voice also does that, passive sentence constructions. In audio, this is all the more so. The reader literally can't go back to the previous sentence to see latter kya hai. So, you want to be aware of this, and this will sometimes happen that if you're telling a story, it's in setting 1, you go to setting 2, you introduce setting 2, then you go back to setting 1, you have to introduce setting 1 again, or you have to indicate the transition in some way, maybe a door closing or whatever, but not necessarily by telling them, but you need to indicate that transition, because the reader can't reverse. So sometimes, like in our writing, we should never repeat ourselves, but sometimes in audio, it might be prudent to throw in a bit of information again, ki who is talking or where are they, just so that you don't confuse the reader or you don't kind of make them go back. Tip number 7, in audio storytelling, you have a tool that you don't have in written storytelling. You have audio. So remember that sound adds depth. That you can show elements of what is happening with sound, which you can't happen otherwise. For example, let us say my story is in a situation where Ajay Shah is in the middle of a forest and he's waiting for someone to turn up. Right? Now you don't have to say that someone is approaching. You can hear the footsteps on gravel. Right? And these sound effects can add so much when you think about it. So if you think creatively about sound, you can figure out a lot of ways where you're telling part of the story through the sound, and you don't really need to spell it out. But the danger here is people can go too far. They can get carried away by the funky effects that they're introducing. So for this, I have a rule that is similar to a writing rule of mine. Like, one thing I will tell my writing students is, for every sentence, ask yourself if the sentence is going forward or deeper. It has to do one of the two things. If it is not, don't use the sentence, right? Now, going forward is, what I mean is in the sense of this happened, then that happened, then that happened, so you're taking the story forward. Going deeper could be either adding context or adding detail or color if you want to create an immersive experience. But you got to go forward or deeper. You don't put a sentence just for the sake of it if it is not adding to the story in some way. So I'd say the same thing for sound effects. The danger if you overdo it is that it can become intrusive. They can be a sound effect for no other reason than, you just felt that, it's a funky sound effect. Why not use it here? But often it can distract, and you want the listeners flow to be with what is going on. And in a sense, we have taken a stumbling journey ourselves when it comes to the show, right? Like with this show, what I do after every episode when I get the rough cut is I'll make time codes and I'll talk about the inserts we want there. Yahan pe ye image, yahan pe ye super, and all of that. And early on, I think we overdid it, right? We would put an insert for every damn thing. And today, my philosophy is that no, we keep it easy. We'll add an insert only when it adds actual value. But if you happen to mention Karl Marx, we don't have to put a photo of Karl Marx there. The reader knows what he looks like, because the trade-off is that every time an insert appears on the screen, a separate visual element, your attention for a moment has to take that in, your brain has to process that. So it is better not to, you want, like if I am talking, I want the listener to just focus on me and not be too distracted. So anything that comes has to have a reason. So it is a similar thing with whatever sound effects you put in, that what is the reason that you're using this element. Every element in any kind of story, audio or otherwise, must have a reason. And my final tip is this, Ajay Shah, that for storytelling, one person is enough. You don't need anything. I think I've spoken about this to you before, that my introduction into podcasting as a listener happened with the great podcast Hardcore History by Dan Carlin. Right now, Dan Carlin is a history lover who basically reads like 40 books for each episode, and he will the episode that I first got introduced to was called Blueprint for Armageddon. It was about World War One. It was a series that together I think must have been 26, 27 hours, 5 episodes of 5 hours each, and it's him talking. There is nothing else. There's a little bit of packaging at the beginning, but there are no sound effects, there's nothing else, it's just him talking. And it is riveting. And he's not even talking with, in particular inflections and dramatizing or whatever. It's like you and I talk to each other. He's just sitting there and talking, and it is incredible. And the first time I heard that, I was riveted. I think I mentioned this again before on the show, that there was a particular battle in World War One where a bunch of soldiers, all died. They were sent on a reckless mission, they all died. But the night before they went on that mission, they wrote, letters to their girlfriends and wives. And Dan Carlin reads some of them out and talks about it. And it is beautiful. You realize the power of audio storytelling when that happens. And the reason I'm making this point is that very often, people will get the imposter syndrome, which they shouldn't, because everyone has stories to tell and you should just go for it. But they will often hold themselves back and say ki, yaar, I don't have great equipment, main akela hu, what do I do? No, you can start it alone. All you need is your imagination, your desire, and your first episode may suck. The first thing Dan Carlin ever did in his life, I'm sure, would make him cringe if it exists today. But you need to start. And I'll talk more about this later.
Okay, Amit, so you've got one concept of a podcast, which is storytelling. It can just be one person, maybe a little bit of audio effects. Okay. And now let's turn to the other category, which are interviews, which is your home locale, which is the seen and the unseen. Is there a whole lot of theory in the structure, or is it just about great organic conversations?
So here's the thing, there is no theory. You can't really read books about it per se. And because I've gone into ground that really no one else has with these oral history type 8-hour podcasts, a lot of the theory I've kind of had to figure out for myself from first principles. But otherwise, many of these would be familiar, but a lot of stuff I've had to figure out on my journey. And I'm the kind of person who likes to sit and take stock every once in a while, think about why am I doing what I'm doing, what does this form give me and all of that. So I have a bunch of thoughts on it, and I'll give a bunch of tips, except I don't even know whether to call this interviewing, because what I often say is I don't interview people, I have conversations where it is sort of a two-way thing and you need that easy flow. Interview sort of implies this formal thing. I'll ask a question, you'll answer, I'll stop, etc., etc. And that doesn't really work for me. And my first tip is a rather obvious tip: ignore all limits. There will be conventions of length. And the conventions of length will be that you can only, like I remember back in the day, a 1 hour interview was considered a deep dive. And people would say, who will listen to 1 hour, yaar? So I give myself full credit in India for shifting the Overton window for podcasts. That because I do these crazy long podcasts, which also have the audience that they do, now nobody feels worried about doing 2-3 hour episodes, right? It is sort of normalized completely. No one will, unless you're really ignorant, you won't call those deep dives. So I give myself some credit for that. But the point is, I did it for a reason, and I will go into some of my reasons. But the bottom line I would say is that don't get trapped by convention that an interview or a conversation has to be one particular way. Think hard about the form. I wrote this essay, we'll link from the show notes, called, a meditation on form, which is about how form dictates the content. Right? If I'm doing a 5-minute podcast and you have written a book, I don't even have to read the book. I can just say, what's a book about or whatever, give me one main point. Half an hour, I can get a chat GPT summary of the book. 1 hour, I should have read the book. I should have intelligent questions. 8 hours, I should have read every book you have ever written and have read other books to get knowledge of the subject on which your one book is. And plus, I should have a deep interest in your life. So the kind of form will dictate the kind of content, and the kind of content will dictate your character. It will change you. You do a longer podcast, you listen much more, you learn to sink in, you learn to be interested in the other person, you learn to introspect while someone is speaking. You take that journey into their lives and into their souls, and that, I really believe, fundamentally changes you. Well, if you're always doing a 5-minute show, you're always you literally have to interrupt there, which is something you should never do in long form. But I'll get into that in my next few points. So my point number 2 is define your purpose. Like, I'm going to have a conversation with you. What am I trying to do? Am I a fox or a hedgehog? Right? Do I want to stay broad, or do I want to go deep into one thing? Right? You are an expert, for example, in explosives. So do I want to dig deep and do a deep dive into explosives with you, or do I want to broadly talk about economics? And to some people, that itself will be narrow. Do I just want to talk about your subject, or do I want to talk about you? If I want to talk about you, do I want to get your knowledge out of you, or do I want to talk about your journey? What part of your journey interests me? So it's important to define your purpose, because your approach will come from that, right? And part of it is actually dictated by the form. Right? If you're doing like a 10-minute episode, I can't do a deep dive into your soul. It's not possible. So I have to kind of stay on the surface. Like, there is a story of, I'll sometimes tell people this, like, people don't believe the kind of people I've turned down for the show. At one point, there is somebody who won a Nobel Prize, and his publisher called me up and said, he's just won the Nobel Prize. We'll fly you to Delhi, do an episode with him. And it would have been a tremendous coup. He would have been on my show the week he won the Nobel Prize. So I said, give me 3 hours with him. And they said, no, we'll just give you 1 hour. I said, no, I want 3 hours. They said, no, 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 just take 1 hour. And I said, no. And the reason I said no is that, if I did 1 hour, I would basically have to speak with him about what he won the Nobel Prize for. Wink, wink, it's our cities. And a narrow subject, and I can't really go too much beyond that. But if I got the 3 hours, I was going to begin the conversation by talking about 1963, when his father taught my father in Presidency College, Calcutta. And I want to begin from there, a sort of a prehistory of the man, as it were. And perhaps if I got to speak to him for 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, I can imagine doing that and not even mentioning his work. His work is great, more power to him. But it is people and their journeys which interest me more. And some of his early papers, honestly, are incredible. Ditto with, I'm talking about Abhijit Banerjee, of course, and Michael Kremer's early work also. It's just mind-blowing, like the O-ring theory, for example. A different format allows you to explore different things. And by that time, I had achieved complete clarity on what I want. Like, I don't care what kind of celebrity you are. I want to get what I want to, I want to get the kind of deep dives into people that I like to get. Otherwise, I'm not doing it. There are 50 other people who will record with you.
So can I come back into this? When I think about the seen and the unseen, I think that the unique cachet is that it goes beyond the headlines. So, you'll read a Wikipedia page on a person, you will get a certain headline, you will read a couple of articles about that person, you will get a certain set of headlines. And I feel what you developed was a whole strategy of a product concept and an audience that was thirsty for more.
Yeah, I wouldn't even. I mean, a product concept sounds like a cold word for me. In some way, the self-actualization. Like, I'll give you an example of this. I was once a couple of years back in Bangalore recording some 6 episodes in 7 days or something crazy. I do that kind of thing. So one evening I had finished a recording, and the next morning I had to record with Sugata Srinivasa Raju, who'd just come out with a massive book on Deve Gowda. Great book, right? And so for my prep, I stayed up all night. I took detailed notes, several thousand words of notes on the book on Deve Gowda. The next day we met, we spoke for 5.5 hours. We did not mention the book. We did not even mention the book because his life was so fascinating. The milieu he grew up in, how he saw the city change and transform itself was so fascinating that we didn't need to mention the book. But I could do that because I'm clear about my purpose. Right? First of all, I'm my own boss. I'm not at a radio station where someone is saying, you have 45 minutes, talk about the book. I don't have that shit. I can do what I want, which is why I have the sort of audience that I have now. And that allowed me to just go to all those places that nobody else goes with him. You want to hear Sugata talk about Deve Gowda, right? You can go on YouTube, you can run a search. There'll be like 50 talks, 40 panel discussions. But you won't get what I spoke to him for 5 hours about. So my next point is actually follows on from this. Is fairly simple. I won't even belabor it, and that is establish tone, right? What tone are you going to have for this conversation? Like many people, when they think of it as an interview, they'll go there with a set of questions, and it'll be a very clipped thing. सवाल पूछेगा जवाब आएगा सवाल पूछेगा जवाब आएगा and that can work. And while putting this course together, I looked at the styles of many different podcasters, and they're really interesting. Russ Robertson, Russ Roberts of the legendary Econ Talk, the OG podcast, I think his approach is similar to mine. Just lie back, just chill, just conversational, kind of go deep. But he doesn't go so deep into people. He'll share a realm of ideas. I don't think he's ever asked anyone, tell me about your father. But it's still my kind of relaxed sort of approach where you don't have a structure to the conversation that is written in stone. Tyler Cowen, just a great podcast and an intellectual I admire so much. His approach is, in a sense, a polar opposite of mine and works beautifully for him. That he'll have a set of questions, and they will be great questions. They will be the kind of questions that someone like me is not even capable of coming up with. And he will go through them, duck. And he won't necessarily, digress completely and go away into some other space like I like to do. So I had this weird experience where Tyler's, his co-blogger on Marginal Revolution, Alex, has been on the show a few times. We get along really well. Tyler came on the show once. It was a remote recording. And I didn't know what to do because it's not his fault. It's not my fault. We are who we are. I would ask a question. He would answer it and stop. And I would ask another question and he would answer it and stop. Clipped answers. And he was doing what he does. And I was not getting into that kind of flow that I want, like one of the really few times, because otherwise by now I'm really good at just making you forget where you are and who you are and just, laying everything out. But so it's a weird kind of like two opposite styles colliding. I think today if I recorded a 5-hour episode with him, I treat it really differently and it was great. But, and there's no right or wrong. You need to figure out for yourself that where do your curiosities take you and how best do you achieve what your curiosities take you, and you want to establish that tone. Maybe it's a really formal tone that Mr. Shah, I'd really like to know, or maybe it's just a really chilled out tone where I just want to have where I want to strip away all the sort of facades between us and just have that intimate conversation. So but the important thing is figure out what tone you want and then figure out the tactic of getting there. Like wink wink, one of my sort of tactics of getting there, which happens to be a tactic but I would do it anyway, is that somebody who's written a book on something will come with their head full of prepared sound bites. They can do the whole thing on autocomplete like chat gpt, right? Everything, the script is ready, and my task is to take them out of autocomplete mode. So I ask them about their childhood. I'll ask them about things that, and the thing is, I'm always doing it with sincerity. When they see that I myself am vulnerable, they also become vulnerable. There are times like Jerry Pinto and I, for example, when we spoke about our mothers, we've teared up together. When they see that you are also laying yourself out there and there is no pretense, then they also kind of mostly reciprocate like that, and that's a great way of getting them to relax. And when you've spoken about things that they haven't spoken about for 40 years, then when they get to their subject also, the sound bites won't be there. They'll be speaking about it much more naturally. So that is one kind of minor technique I have at getting across to the kind of tone I want.
I remember at one point you complained that my answers are too short.
Yeah, you are like the Tyler Cowen kind of person. You just, I admire you greatly, but no. I think you've loosened up a lot. But I think your approach in the early days was you didn't realize what I was trying to do. And you were like, okay, Amit wants to ask me questions about finance. I will give him great answers, the best answers, concise answers. And I remember, we did an episode on the 1991 reforms, and Shruti Rajgopalan and you were the guests. And Shruti was really worried because their styles are very different. Shruti is classic professorial. She'll explain everything in great detail, right? Vaishnav bhi bolega, acha ab bas karo, samajh gaya. But no, she's incredible and she'll explain everything in great detail. And you are the crispest thinker I know. Your clarity is so great that the expression itself is so concise and perfect that there is nothing more to say. So the worry was that she will dominate you. And as it turned out, we or three of us get along so well. We had a great conversation.
It all worked out good. In that episode, I was I was thrown into a quandary over and over by a fundamental problem. Okay, and that fundamental problem was Shruti narrating events in history in present tense. I would constantly get confused. Are you talking about like now, or are you talking about long time ago? Because it's a modern American thing that events from history are narrated in
Oh, okay.
present tense, and I just found it so confusing. So when you were talking about find your voice, that was one idea on my head, that like be clear, events in the past we will use past tense, events in the future we will use future tense, events in the present we will do present tense.
I didn't even notice it. I got to go back and listen to that episode now. So, my next point, do your research. Know what the hell you're talking about. Here's the deal. If I'm talking to you, I can take a set of 10 prepared questions, right? But what if you talk about something else which is interesting to me and I just don't have the knowledge to go in that particular area? So you need your knowledge. Like, you will never know as much as the person you're speaking to has deep knowledge of X. You will never know as much of X as he does, most of the time, as he does or she does. You will never do that, but you have to know enough to be able to have an intelligent conversation on that. I remember when my first two episodes were with Ram Guha were on Gandhi, a subject he's written so many books about. So I didn't just read his books, I read 30 books around the subject to just prep for that. And I was interested in Gandhi myself as a natural, who wouldn't be? So I did the reading anyway. So a lot of the rereading a lot of the reading for the episode was rereading. But I did that. So I could follow, I could take digressions, I could go into different places. So you need to do your prep, and it is always better to over prep. It is always like, I will often do a lot of prep, and then I will feel I have under prepped, I'm not prepared. And then I will find that I haven't used 80% of the prep that I have done, and it doesn't matter. I don't need to use it. I don't need to show off. But having that solid, baseline gives me the ability to go deep with my guests in those areas. So my next tip is respect your guest. Earlier I spoke about respecting your listener, respect your guest, and what I mean by this is, it is an article of faith for me that I do not interrupt. I simply do not do it. I don't look for gotcha moments. I absolutely hate watching shows where people are interrupting all the time. Because what happens there? What happens there is that you are, somebody is speaking, they're going along a particular narrative, then you interrupt them, and it stops them getting deep. And the conversation always stays at a shallow surface level. And it is better to and then after that, they know you're going to interrupt them, so they're always sort of on the alert. They are speaking in half sentences because they are anticipating the interruption, and they can't make nuance points easily, and everything can really go to hell, and that is really disrespectful. My scene is that do not interrupt most of the time. For example, I did this beautiful episode with Mrinal Pandeyji, and I asked her my first question, and then she spoke for 1 hour 5 minutes, and I didn't say a word. And Ajay, it was magic, right? That 1 hour 5 minutes in a mix of Hindi and English, she takes us from a childhood in the 1950s to the end of the 1970s. 27, 28 years, almost 30 years of her life, where she talks about growing up, she talks about her parents, she talks about her mom, she talks about her sisters, she talks about her coming of age as a woman. And and it would have been a disaster to interrupt at any point, which a younger, callower me might have done. And other interviewers, after 2 minutes of that, would say, "हाँ वो तो ठीक है मृणाल जी, लेकिन ये बताइए कि," etc. And you go to hell. She's simply not going to dig so deep anymore after that. The interview is short. You're going to stay at a surface level. So it's super important not to interrupt and to learn to listen. Stephen Covey once said very wisely that most of us listen to respond, we don't listen to understand. And that is so true just in interpersonal communications, that a lot of the time we are listening with our ego. We are listening. Ki Ajay will finish something and then I'll say something that will demolish his point, or I have something smart to show that will show how intelligent I am. And you're listening to respond. Instead, you got to sit back and listen to understand. And it's really important in that process to let your ego out of the window. It is not about you. And men especially love making everything about themselves, right? And it is not about you. Just sit back. You are now a character in the play that is unfolding. You're not the main character with everyone else a prop. You are now a bystander, you are watching, and you can learn and grow so much from that. And this is one of the ways, I don't want to belabor it, it almost sounds like some kind of humble brag or whatever, but this is one of the ways that I have become better at self-reflection, and I think I've become a better listener. And I mean, it doesn't mean one is a good person or anything like that, but these little things at the margins, I think make a difference. Tip number 6 is follow the flow. One thing that irritates me, and you'll see this in a lot of panel discussions you see at LitFest and TV, is that the moderator will have a set of questions, right? I have 8 questions for you. I've asked you question 6. I'm not even listening to your answer to question 6. My mind is already on the segue to question 7. And you might say something super interesting in that in your answer, and that demands a different kind of digression, that demands taking a different path. And for me, that path is huge. That path is where the magic lies. It is a road not taken by everybody else. So for me, what is important is that, when I sort of make a structure, and by the way, dear listener, I've actually shown how I do research for the seen and the unseen. We'll link to that episode. I think it's our productivity episode, Katur Rebhaji. I shared the screen, I show how I do the research. And the thing you'll notice there is I have a list of themes I want to cover. And I have great details and I can go into great depth on them, but there is no sacrosanct structure and there is no order. So in the course of the episode, I'll go where I feel like going. Now I have the luxury to do this because I do long form conversations, but even otherwise, you've got to actively listen. And if there is a moment where you can take a thread and run with it, you should do that.
I think this is the difference between media as a world of appearances and diction, as opposed to genuine fluid intelligence and knowledge. Because what you're describing is a very high ask, that you have to actually parse what the other person said in real time and then be able to go somewhere with it.
So my final point is one that I mentioned in the context of audio storytelling and applies here also. Beware of the curse of knowledge, right? Sometimes you and I might be having a conversation about an arcane topic that both of us understand. So we are using the technical terms and we are making the assumptions that it's like this, but the listener may not know. In fact, this is what you and I exactly did with Vaishnav a couple of episodes ago when we recorded. And even in a conversation format, if you are the host, it's your responsibility to also have one eye on the listener, because remember, respect the listener as much as you respect the guest. You've got to respect both of them, and therefore you have to keep an eye on that. Now, you don't want to explain everything or dumb it down too much, obviously, but at the same time you don't want them completely confused. So often what I'll do is, when on the seen and the unseen, not required with you because you're so lucid, but on the seen and the unseen, when my guest has given a really long answer, I'll often say that let me state this as I understand it, and tell me if I'm right, and then I'll try to put it in simple language. And that's not so much for me, it's also for the listener, that I'm then trying to compress it and synthesize it and put it like that. And perhaps if I make a mistake, which I make, then the guest can correct me right there, and that can also be an interesting conversation. So respect the listener. They're giving you their time, they're giving you their attention. Time is money, attention is energy. You cannot take them for granted, and you have to make them feel like they are participating. You have to make them feel like, to go back to the earlier feedback I received, you have to make them feel like they can interrupt at some point, even though it is rude to interrupt, but they're there with you.
Amit, that sounds nice, but how does it square with 8.5 hours of the blockbuster KP Krishnan conversation? By the way, there are people who have said to me that that podcast is the single most perfect product on understanding the Indian state. So something is going right, but how do you sustain the interest and energy and comprehension of the audience for 8.5 hours?
So I've done a bunch of 6 and 7 hour episodes. I've done 3 8 hour episodes, all classics. I gotta say it myself. One is with Shanta Gokhleji. She's 83 years old. Somebody said, why 8.5 hours? I said 1 hour for each decade of her life. Are you telling me that is sufficient? Are you kidding me? right? It is a remarkable episode. She is a woman of many parts. She's written this great book called Playwright at the Center: The History of Marathi Theatre. She's an authority on the subject. We could not discuss it. We could not discuss Marathi theatre. 8.5 hours wasn't enough. I did an 8-hour episode with Jerry Pinto as well, and he is a beautiful guy. And it was just a fantastic episode. And people to this day keep saying that, man, that Jerry Pinto episode. And someone related this anecdote to me, that there was some book event a couple of days before we are recording. We're recording this in the middle of April, where Jerry Pinto and Shanta Gokhale were both there, and they were signing books separately in adjoining queues. And somebody, was behind the person who was getting her book signed by Jerry, and she said to Jerry, I heard you on the Scene and the Unseen. It was, transformational, etc., etc. And Jerry said, that is okay, but have you heard his episode with Shanta ji? And that's heart fills with joy. But yeah, great question, and I want to talk about that because when I did this course, when I made this list of pointers that I've spoken about, I would do 3-4 hour episodes, and they were deep dives into subjects. Then I fell in love with talking about people, because to get a glimpse of the soul of others was to understand myself better, and to come to terms with who I was as well. And that's incredibly rich. But then I also started thinking about structure. And when you're talking about 8-hour podcasts, like frankly, it's new territory, right? So I don't have a guidebook anywhere. I have to figure out my own theory. With my practice, I am setting my theory. So now, broadly, how I approach these episodes is there are, of course, approaches for making our guests comfortable, loosening them up, and getting with that flow. And it involves complete honesty on my part, which is visible. But the way I think about it structurally is I think of there being 3 overlapping scaffoldings, right, along which around which the episode is constructed. One of those is that person's biography, their life, that I have lived 80 years, these are the things I have done, this is my journey. So their biographical journey is one scaffolding. Another scaffolding is their work, which could be the books they have written or whatever they have achieved and all that, and that is a second scaffolding. And a third scaffolding is themes and ideas I want to discuss with them, many of which will come up during the conversation, because mind you, again, I'm paying attention, I'm passing everything. Some idea will come, ki, let me talk about this with this person. So it is like an evolving whatever. And and in my mind, I've been thinking that I should be balanced about these, that it should be a balance of these. If it is too much about ideas, it might feel abstract to somebody. If it is too much about life, that could also be off-putting. But there is no order कि पहले life करेंगे फिर ये करेंगे. They are interlocking, and it is up to me to figure out where to go without sort of breaking the flow. And for me, the perfect episode in which I got all of these together and had a remarkable guest was episode 301 with Natasha Badwar. A remarkable episode, extremely generous woman, spoke about parenting and writing and all of those things. And that for me, in terms of construction, was a perfect episode. One episode where I felt the balance went wrong is actually a great episode and a very popular episode with Nilanjana Roy. Both of us know her. And with Nilanjana, I felt that we spoke a lot about ideas. That part of the scaffolding was super heavy. We didn't speak enough about her life. So we didn't get to speak about her years in journalism and all of that. We barely got to the Otties, and the episode, which was 5 hours, 45 minutes, sort of ended. So I was wondering later that, is that balance okay? Is it work? But it's one of my top 10 episodes. It's like a sleeper hit, in terms of downloads. I'm not saying in terms of subjective taste, but in terms of downloads, it's one of the top 10. It's a massive sleeper hit. So clearly it worked. It resonated with people. But this is a guide I set out for myself, and my thinking on this is evolving all the time, but it's very much learning by doing and then reflecting on it and trying to construct a theory.
So, Amit, I think of everything that you have described as a new moment in the way the culture works. Okay, so in the olden days, there was a world of the books, the journals, a little bit of newspaper, okay, and that was the way the world was organized. Now we are in flux, and an entirely new apparatus of culture is emerging, and you have been living it in the sense of podcasting, but then you're also observing other pieces of the story. For example, you imagined everything is everything as a concept and as something new that should be attempted. So give us some insight on how all this fits together, that what is the meaning of the intellectual community, what is the meaning of discourse, and how do all these pieces fit together?
So I've done many pieces, or I've done many episodes of the Seen and the Unseen with creators on the creator economy. I've thought deeply about it. I've learned a lot of lessons about it on the way, and I'd like to take you through some of the big headline lessons that I have learned. So lesson number one, and this is the opposite of what you would recommend for the world of policy, but it's perfect for creators. Lesson number one is have a bias for action. Right? To me, I think of whatever we do in life, there is a trade off. There is a trade off between getting it done and getting it right. Now, both are important. Getting it right is important. It takes a lot of preparation to get something right. Abraham Lincoln once said, give me 6 hours to chop down a tree, and I'll spend the first 5 sharpening the axe. So, preparation is important and it has its place, but it can be taken too far, because what will often happen is that the human brain is wired to procrastinate. It hates work. We'll procrastinate forever. And Neil Simon once had this resonant line read as a kid, I think from his play Barefoot in the Park, where he said, there are two kinds of people in the world, the watchers and the doers, and the watchers sit around watching the doers do. Right? So my plea to all creators out there is have a bias for action and just do. You know, err on the side of getting it done. If you're faced with a choice of getting it right and getting it done, I want you to get it done. Because remember, as Vinay Sitapati, a mutual friend of ours, once told me in his first episode with me, perfection is the enemy of production. Right? And you want to get the work out there. And there is a reason for wanting to get the work out there. And the reason is this, that when we start doing something, Ajay Shah, we suck at it. I don't listen to early episodes of The Seen and the Unseen. I tell people reverse order mein suno. Similarly, I will tell people don't see the early episodes of Everything is Everything, because early on you're learning. Even this is part, we will look back on these episodes 2 years later and no doubt find flaws with it. You learn by doing. You don't learn by planning. You don't learn by sharpening an axe. You can't learn how to cut a tree by sharpening an axe. You have to cut the tree to learn how to cut the tree. So it is important to have that bias for action and to just do.
So I have two things in connection to this. The first is that my slogan, my motto since childhood has been that life is not a spectator sport. So I don't want to see other people living their life in whatever little mediocre way. I want to live my life. So, my playing cricket to me is more important than watching Sachin Tendulkar play cricket. So better to live it and do it rather than to watch other people doing it. And my second idea in this is that in the culture, I feel this kind of bias for action that you've described will work out better if all of us will just concentrate on the best works of others. Okay, so I just don't care about the bad things you did. I only care about the best things you did. Okay, so if that's our culture, rather than griping and sniping and being negative and criticizing the bad things that you did, what is the benefit to all of us as society if I will harp on your weak moments? So if the culture becomes that all of us will understand that we all screw up and we all make mistakes and we all do bad things, but we will treasure and respect and value the best things that we have done, then suddenly everybody's bar will come down and we'll be more ready to jump into the pond and do some things knowing that we suck, and that's okay.
So, in your XKDR anniversary party, our friend Bhargavi Zaveri was asking these incredibly stimulating questions. And one of the questions was that we had to complete the sentence. There are two kinds of people in the world. Who are they? And my answer was there are two kinds of people in the world, the doers and the whiners. And you have described the whiners. And creators aren't like this. Creators are doers, right? We are positive people. Whenever I see somebody whining about so-and-so creator, so-and-so podcaster, so-and-so YouTuber, I'm saying, my first thought is do not whine. If you don't like what they have done, go out and do it better. Do not whine about, oh, so and so is
Or
doing
do
this.
not partake.
Yeah.
Like nobody forces you
No, but
to read somebody else's article
ex-
or watch somebody else's show.
and my, related advice to creators would be that get these toxic people out of your life, get negativity out of your life, watch good things, celebrate good things, share good things, and people in your life who are kind of whining all the time and who are filling you with doubts, get them out of your life if you can. You all can't always, but if you can get them out of your life, you need to be positive. And I want to come to my second big tip here, which is something that you and I have internalized, and it applies to policy as well. And that second tip is play the long game, right? And to paraphrase something once someone once said about, I think, futurists or science fiction writers, creators also tend to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. So a creator will often think that अरे मैं YouTube show करूँगा, मेरे 1 million views होंगे, इतना पैसा आएगा, ये होगा वो होगा. No. It's not going to happen. You should never think like that. And equally, they underestimate the long term, because when organic growth happens, you reach a certain point, you don't know where it can go. But don't overestimate the short term, play the long game. And I'll tell you why this is important. And but first, I'll talk about a YouTube creator I really like, Ali Abdal. Who does these great productivity videos, when he reached 1 million subscribers, he did this superb video where he showed this graph that you see on the screen right now, and this is a subscriber growth. And you, as an economist and a data person, will know that this is showing an exponential curve, right? That for a long time nothing happens, and then it just takes off till the line is practically vertical. And he points out that he, made, I think, 2 videos a week for the first 26 weeks of his thing. And whenever he reached video number 50, that is when he reached his 1,000th subscriber. Now, most people are not going to make 50 videos when they have less than 1,000 subscribers. They are simply not doing it. The validation matters to them. But, Ali perhaps had the precocious insight, or maybe he just loved doing what he was doing, and he went on with it. And then eventually it kind of took off. And the advice that he gave in a later video, and we'll link both of them from the show notes, was an advice for new creators that I think is incredible advice, and it has come from a doer, and therefore I take it seriously. And the advice is that for the first 2 years, make 2 videos a week and do not look at the numbers. Right, 2 videos a week. You and I are doing 1 video a week. He said, make 2 videos a week and do not look at the numbers. That's 200 videos without looking at the numbers. And this is super important, and I'll tell you why. One, of course, is that growth can be organic. You don't want to get disheartened. But there is a larger thing at play here. Again, it's constant iteration that leads to excellence. That is the only way. We only learn by doing. Before we learn to be great, we have to be good. Before we learn to be good, we have to learn how to do the thing in the most clumsy way possible. And if we crave validation, that will never happen. If we crave validation, then after 6 weeks, 8 weeks, after 30 videos, we'll just give up. We'll say, nahi karna hai. But if you're doing it because you love doing it, because it is intrinsic to who you are, then you will continue, then you can become good, then you can become great. And I think of that as a super important mindset to sort of take into the journey. And this again ties in with the earlier point of be authentic to yourself. If what you're producing is because you're authentic to yourself, then it's fine. Do it for the love. And out of the love, everything good will emerge. But if you always trying to chase the numbers, looking at the data, turning your content around for what people want, you will end up being nothing. You will lose your soul. And that is not the route to success.
I have a slightly different twist on that. I agree with the thrust of what you're saying. I think that when people are inauthentic and putting on a show to sell to the world, you can do it for a finite amount of time, but then you will peter out, and then you'll more rapidly just lose interest and lose attention. Whereas only in being authentic do we have the hope of just plowing ahead and doing it well and doing it over and over, and then we get to the iterative refinement.
And my third piece of advice is something that, something that I put into practice long ago, but I didn't put into words as well as Paul Graham did, where I think Sam Altman quoted Paul Graham as giving him, this great insight. And the insight is, it is better to be loved by a few than be liked by many. And this is a big freaking deal. It is better to be loved by a few than liked by many. And this is really what I strive for, and the intimacy of the audio medium, for example, gives you that, where you are loved by a few. And when you are loved by a few, that love will also make them support you in different ways. They will feel an ownership in what you do. Our friend Sudhir Sarnobat, in the days before he was my friend, before I knew him, once heard an episode that had, I think, 114 show notes or something. And at one point he wrote to me and he said, you miss linking this book. Right? He actually noticed that I had missed, that there were 114 show notes, but I missed something. And that is the kind of love that you want. Kevin Kelly, many years ago, wrote this great essay, I think 15 years ago, wrote this great essay called 1,000 True Fans. And his funda was that in this modern world, you no longer need to scale. You need 1,000 true fans, loved by a few, who are willing to pay $100 a year. And he's saying, then you're making $100,000 a year. What's the problem? It was theoretical back in 2009 or whenever he wrote that. Micropayments weren't easy. There was friction, etc., etc. Today, it is reality. If you look at Substack, the Substack model is that your annual subscription is often $100. for a year. So you have that coming to reality. There was another recent essay written which I'll link, which says no, 100 true fans is enough. You get 100 fans to pay you like $1,000 a year, and that's again 100,000. And I'm like, forget the money, forget the sort of economics of it and the great creators. Like on Substack, some completely unknown people. There's a guy called Bill Bishop who writes this newsletter on China called Cynicism. Now, he's not a mainstream guy, and he's writing about what you would think is a niche subject, so niche that mainstream people may not commission him to write pieces. But he's a superstar. He's a superstar out there and must be making millions, right? And so creators have that, and I would say that go for that, because the shallow likes you get don't really matter. Like I often say, and I used to say this before I became a YouTuber, but it holds true, that I would rather have 100,000 people listen to an episode of The Seen and the Unseen than get 10 million likes on YouTube. And the reason is that the 10 million likes on YouTube are shallow. Your average view time of many channels could be 15 seconds each. Whereas, my average session time, the last time I calculated it, goes to like 40 minutes, was 40 minutes at the time. If you told me this in the aughties, where I was an editor of an online publication, I would have said you are lying. Only with the most immersive video game can you get that kind of stickiness. And it's not just my podcast you get it with. It is the nature of the medium that you get a much higher depth of engagement. So loved by a few, is more important than being liked by many. And my final point before the light runs out, my final point is that think out of the box, right? What will often happen is there'll be a successful show. Like Serial is successful, for example, the audio podcast. And then everybody will do copycat shows like that with the same structure, with the same tone, with the same voice, right? And my thing is, don't do that. Think out of the box. Do funky things. Think different languages if you're an Indian. In India, the English market is so well served. It is saturated because, you get all the podcasts from all over the world you can listen to. Hindi wala kya sunega, bhai? Malayalam wala kya sunega? So make things for that market also. So I would say if your proficiency in English is 100 and your proficiency in Hindi is 80, do Hindi. Not just because of market necessarily. You should do what is authentic to you. But if you can be authentic to yourself in a language, don't feel that it is infra dig. There is an audience there that needs you more and that will love you more.
Okay, Amit, you've talked about the principles and philosophy. Now take us closer to the implementation. I have known many people who are intimidated at the prospect of how to record audio files and fix them up using Audacity and how to publish them and what's the RSS feed and all that. Take us through the implementation.
Right. So I have the equivalent of like 10, 11 slides on this, but the light is running out. So what I will do is I will very quickly say what I have to say, but I will figure out a way to link a document from the show notes, which has all the details for you. So that's, what I'll do. For now, what I'll say is that you don't need anything to start. Everything is kind of available for free. You want a hosting service, you can host an Anchor. You want to record, you can do your first recordings with your mobile phones, frankly. Eventually, of course not, but you get cheap microphones out there. Now, if you're looking at a microphone situation, my advice would be to think hard about that there are two different kinds of mics, dynamic mics and condenser mics. The mics you see in recording studios are condenser mics, incredibly sensitive, capture every nuance of your voice, but they also capture a lot of surrounding sound. Even if they're cardioid and directional and all of that, they'll capture surrounding sound, which is why in a treated studio they are great. But if you have a home studio, you don't want to use that kind of mic. A dynamic mic will only capture what is proximate to it and not the sound around it. So when you see a rock star performing at a concert and holding a mic to their face, that is a dynamic mic, because otherwise a condenser mic would pick up the sound of the audience and you would not get anything that you can listen to. But that is a dynamic mic. So for podcasters, I'd say get a dynamic mic. My recommendation is the ATR 2100X. It's an Audio Technica mic. It costs about 7,000 rupees. Great mic. The good part of it is that it has both USB connection and the regular aux connection to whatever audio interface you might have. So the USB connection means that you can just attach it to your laptop and you're good to go. You can use it for Zoom calls, you can use it for everything. There's a lot of other gyan to go, but one piece of technology that you and I cannot control, Ajay Shah, even in these modern times, is the sun. And the sun is kind of setting on us, but literally, not metaphorically, and not even literally, because the sun isn't setting, the earth is turning. So dear listeners, thank you for this. This is a subject I'm deeply passionate about, because everything that I've shared is stuff that I've learned by doing. and I've immersed myself in this. So I hope some of it is sort of useful to you. I can never do my podcasting course again because I have shared all the main things here. I have tried to do, the higher level, higher order thoughts, the broad thinking. I've also tried to go deep into nuances. There'll be a document there which also has a technical stuff, but the spoiler alert is that you can really do it for very cheap or you can do it for free. And my final words to you would be, have a bias for action. Don't hesitate. Get out there, create something now, put it up. It is okay. That is the only way you learn. That is the only way you become better. So don't hold yourself back.